Okay, I want to ask G Parthasarathy, one of the things that's being said is that China is having to recalibrate because of A, what's happening vis-a-vis the Taiwan question. You're seeing the Western countries, particularly the United States, taking a far more strident position today on Taiwan than they were before. China is also concerned about what's happening in Afghanistan because remember, the Taliban have now effectively formed a government, but it's not like Chinese interests or Chinese projects in Afghanistan are any more safer today than they were a year and a half ago. That's the second part. And the third part, which is the most important thing, is how many fronts can China afford to open? They already have multiple disputes in the South China Sea with Vietnam, with Thailand, with Malaysia, Indonesia, in the East China Sea with Japan. There's also a dispute with South Korea. And of course, not to mention the running standoff with India at the line of actual control. Can they afford to confront, amidst all of this, also American troops and Taiwanese troops in a bid to try and militarily and forcefully reunify Taiwan?
Look, let's face the reality. Xi Jinping is shortly coming up for re-election. There is talk of people in China believing that he's too centralized in his power structure and so on. So he is going to look primarily on his domestic politics. So whatever he does is going to be determined by that. He will not like to be seen to be losing face. At the same time, he knows that with the American, Taiwan is going to be not just a piece of cake to go after. So they are also in a quandary. The limitations of their power are being exposed. And more importantly, they've handled the COVID problem horribly, locking up people for long periods of time. There is restiveness within the country. So Xi Jinping will not want at this time to be getting into too many fronts of trouble. India is one country where I think he would see the problem is manageable, but I would wait to see if the Prime Minister, meet in Tashkent or sorry in
Uzbekistan, Samarkand.
Samarkand, and let us see how it plays. Yes, everybody has a point here. But how do governments have to? Governments, Mr. Modi now has got very nicely what we wanted on energy, and we are not going to buckle to Western pressure. We're getting oil and gas at much better terms than we've had for a long time. The economy has to chug along. This is what every political leader in the world is looking for. So we will.
Sushant, one thing, Sushant, that G Parthasarathy also referred to is the fact that military power draws itself from economic power, and for the longest time, China, of course, was the second biggest economy in the world. It was all set to surpass the United States very soon. But in the last year and a half, maybe, we're seeing massive economic problems within China. How much is that having a bearing on its own responses to these strategic challenges, whether they're in the East and South China Seas, or for that matter, at the line of actual control with India?
Zaka, I'm not entirely sure of how deeply in crisis the Chinese economy is, especially when I compare it with the kind of crises that are afflicting, the US is in recession, Europe is having major problems, both on the energy crisis as well as they have a major economic crisis among all the countries with high inflation and what have you. Now, how deeply is the Chinese economy affected by the various confrontations they have gotten into? Yeah. I think that's a bit of a question mark. But I would imagine that, there would be some areas where they would like to cool down things for now and perhaps open them up later, India being a prime example of that. But in many of the other cases in South China Sea, most of those other countries simply have not been able to stand up to China. They have cowered under Chinese pressure. They have backed off. India is one of those countries which has not entirely backed off, and yet I'm not entirely sure if we have, really gotten back status quo ante as existed before April 2020. And as Brahma very correctly says, that some of the problems and some of the more prickly problems go back to 2013 and even earlier, especially in Depsang and Demchok as far as Eastern Ladakh is concerned. And those problems continue to stay outstanding. And they pose a far more potent challenge to our security than perhaps some of these other skirmishes which have taken place or the other standoffs which have taken place.
Andrew,